when we had to divide our father's business. My brother forged the documents and took everything for himself. "You have no rights here anymore," he said. "This is my property. You didn't do anything anyway. It wasn't your business." Later, he came to ask me for money to save the business, but it was already too late. Let me tell you how this whole mess started. You know how family businesses are supposed to bring people together? Well, ours tore us apart faster than a cheap dollar store umbrella in a tornado. My dad ran this antique restoration shop downtown for 37 years. Place was his whole life. Every morning at 6 sharp, coffee in one hand, keys in the other. He'd unlock that heavy wooden door like he was opening a treasure chest. And honestly, that's kind of what was. Dad had this gift for seeing potential in broken things. Old chairs with wobbly legs, scratch tables that looked like firewood. He'd bring them back to life. I spent most of my childhood in that shop. While other kids were playing video games, I was learning the difference between mahogany and cherry wood. Dad taught me everything. How to strip paint without damaging the grain, which stains work best on different woods, how to spot a genuine antique from a clever fake. My brother Mike, he was always more interested in the business side. Numbers, customers, dealing with suppliers. We made a good team, actually. Dad always said the shop would be ours someday. Both of ours. He'd lean against his workbench, sawdust in his hair, and talk about how Mike could handle the front end while I worked on the pieces. It made sense. Mike was smooth with people, could sell ice to an Eskimo. I was a craftsman, the one who actually knew how to fix things. But you know what they say about the best laid plans of mice and men. Dad never got around to writing that will. Every time I brought it up, he'd wave his hand and say there was plenty of time for that lawyer stuff later. Cancer had other ideas. The funeral was rough. Small town, so half the community showed up. Dad was one of those guys everyone respected. Honest, hardworking, never cheated anybody. After we put him in the ground, I figured Mike and I would sit down and figure out how to split things up. 50-50 seemed fair. I'd been working alongside Dad for 15 years, putting in 60-hour weeks, learning every trick of the trade. I stayed at the shop that whole week after the funeral. Couldn't bear to go home to my empty apartment. Instead, I cleaned, organized, tried to keep busy. The place felt so quiet without Dad's radio playing classic rock and his voice humming along to Eagle songs. I found myself talking to him sometimes, asking what he'd want me to do with certain pieces. The shop was crammed with projects in various stages of completion. There was Mrs. Henderson's dining set that needed new legs, the antique armoire that belonged to the Johnson family, about 6 chairs that needed reupholstering. I kept working on them, figuring Mike and I would need to finish everything before we made any big decisions about the future. Mike came by every few days, usually just to check the register and count whatever cash had come in. He seemed different after Dad died, more serious, less talkative. I figured he was grieving in his own way. We all handle loss differently, right? Then came that Tuesday morning that changed everything. Mike walked into the shop carrying a manila folder, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He set it down on Dad's old desk, the one with coffee rings and pencil marks all over it, and cleared his throat. The documents looked official enough. Legal letterhead, notary stamps, the whole 9 yards. But something felt off the moment I started reading. The date was from about a month before Dad passed. According to these papers, Dad had signed the entire business over to Mike. Everything. The building, the inventory, the customer list, even Dad's personal tools. I knew Dad's handwriting better than my own. I'd watched him fill out invoices and write estimates for years. The signature looked close, but not quite right. The way he made his capital letters was different. And the date? Dad was barely conscious that last month. Hopped up on morphine most of the time. No way he was conducting business meetings with lawyers. Mike wouldn't look me in the eye while I read through everything. Just kept fidgeting with his keys, staring at the floor. When I finally looked up, he was ready with his speech. Probably practiced it in the mirror at home. The business belonged to him now. Dad had made his decision. I was welcome to find work elsewhere, but I needed to clear out my personal stuff by the end of the week. Just like that. 29 years old, and I was unemployed with nowhere to go. I tried reasoning with him, reminded him about all those conversations Dad had about us working together, pointed out how much I contributed to building the business. Mike just shrugged and said Dad must have changed his mind. Maybe he'd seen something in my work that wasn't up to par. Maybe he thought Mike was better suited to run things alone. That stung worse than losing the business. Dad had never criticized my craftsmanship. Never. He'd taught me to take pride in every detail, to treat each piece like it was going to my own home. The idea that he'd suddenly lost faith in me, it didn't make sense. I asked Mike if I could at least take some of Dad's personal tools as keepsakes. The plane he'd inherited from his own father. Maybe the hand sanders he bought when he first opened the shop. Mike thought about it for about 2 seconds before shaking his head. Business assets, he said. Everything stayed with the business. But then he seemed to have a moment of guilt or something. Maybe he remembered we used to be brothers. He told me I could take some old boxes from the basement storage area. Stuff that had been sitting down there for years, covered in dust. Junk that nobody wanted anyway. I wasn't in any position to argue. I needed something, anything, to remember Dad by. So I spent my last afternoon in the shop hauling these wooden crates up from the basement. They were heavier than they looked, packed tight with something wrapped in old blankets and newspapers. Mike watched me load them into my beat-up pickup truck, probably making sure I wasn't stealing anything valuable. The whole situation left me feeling hollowed out inside. Not just losing the business, but losing my brother too. We'd grown up together, shared the same bedroom until high school, learned to drive in the same rusty Chevy. Now he was treating me like some employee he barely knew. Small towns have long memories, and word traveled fast about the arrangement. Some people seemed surprised that Dad had left everything to Mike. Others figured it made business sense. Mike was older, better with money, more likely to keep the place profitable. I didn't bother correcting anyone's assumptions. What was the point? Finding new work proved harder than expected. Mike had connections all over town from dealing with suppliers and customers. He'd inherited Dad's reputation along with everything else. Meanwhile, I was just a guy who used to work for his brother. Not exactly the strongest reference in the world. I ended up renting a spot in this rundown trailer park on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just enough space for a bed, a kitchenette, and somewhere to put those mysterious boxes I'd salvaged from the shop. The rent was cheap, which was good because my savings account was looking pretty pathetic. Those first few weeks were the darkest period of my life. I'd wake up every morning with nowhere to go, nothing to do. Applied for jobs at hardware stores, furniture shops, anywhere that might value my experience with woodworking. Most places weren't hiring, and the ones that were offered minimum wage for grunt work. After 15 years of skilled craftsmanship, the thought of stocking shelves or running a cash register felt like giving up on everything Dad had taught me. The boxes sat in the corner of my trailer, like some kind of monument to my former life. I couldn't bring myself to open them at first. They reminded me too much of everything I'd lost. But one rainy evening, when the walls felt like they were closing in and I couldn't stand watching another rerun on my tiny TV, curiosity finally got the better of me. So there I was, living in a trailer that probably violated about 15 health codes, surviving on ramen noodles and whatever expired food I could find marked down at the grocery store. The American dream, right? My neighbor was this guy who claimed he used to be in a band but spent most of his time yelling at his TV during football games. Real classy neighborhood. The job hunt was going about as well as you'd expect. Turns out having your brother own the biggest antique business in town makes it pretty hard to find work in the same field. Every furniture shop, every restoration place, every antique dealer, they all knew Mike. And Mike, well, let's just say he wasn't exactly putting in good words for me. I remember this one interview at a furniture refinishing place about 20 miles out of town. The owner seemed interested until he made a phone call to check my references. I could hear him talking to someone, probably Mike, and his whole attitude changed. Suddenly, I went from a potential hire to someone who gets shown the door real quick. The rejection letters started piling up. Generic stuff mostly. We decided to go with someone else. We'll keep your resume on file. Thanks for your interest. I started applying for jobs outside my field just to pay the bills. Gas stations, restaurant kitchens, construction crews. Anything that would take a guy with calloused hands and a desperate look in his eyes. My savings were disappearing faster than free beer at a tailgate party. The trailer rent was cheap, but when you're making nothing, even cheap feels expensive. I had to choose between buying groceries and keeping the electricity on. Usually went with the electricity because eating cold soup in the dark seemed too depressing even for my current situation. 3 months in, I was seriously considering calling my cousin in Phoenix. He'd mentioned there was construction work out there, decent pay for guys willing to work in the desert heat. The idea of starting over somewhere new seemed both terrifying and appealing. At least nobody in Arizona would know about my family drama. But pride is a funny thing. Even when you're broke and desperate, it's hard to admit complete defeat. I kept telling myself things would turn around, that I'd find something local, that I wouldn't have to leave everything behind and run away like some kind of failure. Those wooden crates from Dad's basement sat in the corner of my trailer, like silent witnesses to my downfall. Every time I looked at them, I felt this mixture of curiosity and dread. Part of me wanted to know what Dad had considered worth keeping in storage for all those years. Another part of me was afraid they'd just be more reminders of what I'd lost. The boxes were old, probably from the 50s or 60s based on the hardware and the way they were constructed. Heavy wooden frames with metal corner brackets, designed to protect whatever was inside during shipping. The kind of packaging you don't see anymore in our disposable world. Someone had wrapped them in old leather straps that were cracking with age. I kept putting off opening them. Every time I got close, I'd find some excuse to do something else. Check the want ads again, walk to the corner store, organize my pathetic collection of belongings. Anything to avoid confronting whatever memories or disappointments might be waiting inside those dusty containers. But financial desperation has a way of making decisions for you. By month 4, I was 2 weeks behind on trailer rent and down to my last $23. The landlord had started leaving increasingly aggressive notes on my door. My truck was making a grinding noise that probably meant expensive repairs I couldn't afford. I was running out of options fast. That's when I remembered something Dad used to say about the storage areas in the shop. He'd joke that the basement was like a time capsule, full of projects people had abandoned or pieces he bought and forgotten about. Sometimes customers would bring in furniture they never came back to claim. Sometimes Dad would buy entire estate collections and not get around to cataloging everything right away. Maybe there was something in those boxes I could sell. Nothing valuable probably, but even junk could bring in a few dollars at a garage sale or online. I was desperate enough to consider selling my own furniture, which consisted of a folding table, 2 plastic lawn chairs, and a mattress on the floor. Not exactly a gold mine there. So one rainy Thursday evening, with the sound of my neighbor's TV bleeding through the thin trailer walls, I finally worked up the nerve to open the first crate. My hands were shaking a little as I undid the old leather straps. Partly from nervousness, partly from the caffeine withdrawal headaches I'd been getting since I couldn't afford decent coffee anymore. The first layer was old newspapers and blankets, probably used as padding. The papers were from the late 50s, full of ads for cars that looked like spaceships and household appliances that promised to revolutionize American life. Reading through them was like looking into a museum exhibit about optimism and progress. Underneath the padding, I found carefully wrapped wooden components. Not furniture exactly, but pieces that looked like they were meant to become furniture. Everything was meticulously organized, with small paper tags tied to different parts with string. The handwriting on the tags was tiny and precise, noting things like finish types and assembly instructions. At first glance, it looked like modernist design. Clean lines, geometric shapes, the kind of stuff you'd see in those mid-century magazines about atomic age living. Not really my style. I was more used to traditional antiques, carved details, ornate craftsmanship. This stuff was almost aggressively simple by comparison. But simple didn't mean cheap. Even my untrained, I could tell that whoever made these pieces knew what they were doing. The wood was premium quality, probably teak or walnut. The joints were perfect, cut with precision that spoke of serious craftsmanship. Each piece felt substantial, built to last for generations rather than fall apart after a few years. The second crate contained more of the same, plus what looked like original design sketches and assembly instructions. Everything was in pristine condition, like it had been packed away the day it was made and never touched since. The paper tags had numbers that seemed to correspond to a cataloging system, though I didn't recognize the format. I spread everything out on my trailer floor, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Some pieces were obviously table legs. Others looked like bench components or cabinet frames. There were brackets and hardware still in their original packaging, metal pieces with that distinctive brass finish that screamed expensive manufacturing. One set of papers caught my attention. They looked like shipping manifests or invoices, dated 1958, with a company name I didn't recognize. The quantities listed were small, maybe prototype runs or custom orders. Whatever this stuff was, it wasn't mass-produced furniture from some factory. This was specialty work, the kind of thing wealthy people commission for their ultra-modern homes. I started taking pictures with my phone, thinking I could maybe research the designs online. The internet is pretty good for identifying vintage furniture these days. Collectors love showing off their knowledge, and there are forums dedicated to every possible style and period. Maybe someone would recognize these pieces and give me an idea of what they might be worth. But my phone was older than some of the furniture I used to restore, and the camera wasn't great in the dim trailer lighting. The pictures came out blurry and hard to make out details. I'd need better photos if I wanted to get any useful information from online furniture experts. The third crate was the heaviest, and when I opened it, I understood why. More components, but also what looked like original catalog pages and marketing materials. Professional photographs of finished pieces in stylish room settings, complete with atomic age decor and people wearing the kind of clothes that scream sophisticated urban living. Looking at those old marketing photos, I started to get a strange feeling. This wasn't just good furniture. This was iconic design. The kind of stuff that museums collect and rich people fight over at auctions. But how had it ended up forgotten in Dad's basement? And why hadn't anyone ever mentioned owning pieces like this? The more I examined everything, the more questions I had. Dad was good at recognizing quality antiques, but his expertise was mainly traditional American and European pieces. Ornate Victorian stuff, colonial reproductions, maybe some Art Deco if he was feeling adventurous. This modernist design was way outside his usual wheelhouse. Maybe someone had brought it in for restoration and never picked it up. Maybe Dad had bought it as part of an estate sale and stuck it in storage, meaning to research it later. Maybe it was just good quality reproductions that someone had taken care to preserve. Without more information, I was just guessing. What I did know was that I needed to find someone who could tell me what I was actually looking at. Someone with expertise in mid-century modern design. Someone who could separate the valuable from the merely old. Someone who might be able to help me turn these mysterious crates into enough money to get back on my feet. Little did I know that opening those boxes would set off a chain of events that would completely change my life. Sometimes the things we think are worthless turn out to be exactly what we need. And sometimes the answer to our problems has been sitting right under our noses, waiting for us to be desperate enough to actually look. I knew I needed expert help, but finding someone who specialized in mid-century modern furniture wasn't exactly easy in our small town. Most of the antique dealers around here focus on farmhouse chic and colonial reproductions, the kind of stuff that sells to tourists looking for authentic Americana. Asking them about sleek modernist design would be like asking a country music fan to explain jazz theory. That's when I remembered Richard Steinberg. He used to come into Dad's shop maybe once or twice a year, usually looking for specific pieces or offering to buy items that caught his eye. Dad always treated him with unusual respect, the way you treat someone whose knowledge you genuinely admired. Richard specialized in restoration work, but his focus was completely different from ours. Contemporary design, architectural furniture, pieces that belonged to museums rather than farmhouse dining rooms. The problem was getting in touch with him. I didn't have his contact information, and it's not like modernist furniture experts advertise in a local phone book. I spent 2 days calling around to different antique shops and galleries, asking if anyone knew how to reach a guy named Richard who specialized in contemporary design. Finally, The owner of an art gallery about 30 miles away gave me a number. Richard had his workshop in the city, about an hour's drive from my trailer park. When I called, he sounded busy and slightly annoyed. Apparently, he got a lot of calls from people who thought their mass-produced furniture from the 70s was actually valuable vintage pieces. I tried to explain that I had some unidentified furniture components that might be worth examining, but I could tell he was only half listening. He'd heard this pitch 1,000 times before. Everybody thinks they've discovered hidden treasure in their grandmother's attic. Most of the time, it's just old furniture that looks fancy but has no real collector value. Richard finally agreed to take a look, but only because I'd mentioned working with my father's restoration business. He remembered Dad as someone who knew quality when he saw it, even if their specialties were completely different. That reputation bought me a meeting, though Richard made it clear he was doing me a favor and didn't expect to find anything interesting. The drive to Richard's workshop felt like going to a job interview where you know you're not qualified. My truck was making that grinding noise worse than ever, and I kept worrying it would break down before I got there. I'd loaded the most promising pieces from the first crate, trying to pick components that would give Richard the best sense of what I was dealing with. His workshop was in this converted warehouse district that had been gentrified into artist studios and trendy lofts. The kind of place where parking costs more per hour than I used to make in a day. Richard's space was immaculate. White walls, polished concrete floors, carefully arranged examples of restored furniture that looked like they belonged in architectural magazines. Richard himself was about 60, wearing the kind of casual clothes that probably cost more than my trailer rent. Wire-rimmed glasses, perfectly groomed beard, the confident bearing of someone who knew his expertise was valuable and rare. He looked at me like I was probably wasting his time, but was willing to humor me for a few minutes out of respect for Dad's memory. I started unpacking the components I brought, laying them out on his clean work table. Richard's expression didn't change at first, still polite but skeptical, probably thinking about how quickly he could get me out of there. He picked up a few pieces, examined the joinery and the wood grain with the kind of casual expertise that comes from decades of experience. Then he stopped, just froze completely, holding one of the leg assemblies like he'd never seen anything like it before. His whole demeanor changed in about 3 seconds. The polite skepticism disappeared, replaced by the kind of intense focus you see in emergency room doctors when something serious walks through the door. He set the piece down very carefully and picked up another component, then another. His hands were moving faster now, examining joints and finishes with the urgency of someone who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. He grabbed a magnifying glass from his workbench and started looking at details I hadn't even noticed. After about 5 minutes of this increasingly frantic examination, Richard finally looked up at me. His face had gone completely pale, like he'd just witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the world. The question he asked me was simple enough. Where exactly had these pieces come from? I explained about Dad's basement storage, about the boxes that had been sitting there for years, about Mike letting me take what he considered worthless junk. Richard listened to every word like I was describing a location of buried treasure, which apparently I was. What I had brought him, Richard explained, were unassembled original components from George Nelson's platform bench series. Nelson was one of the most important furniture designers of the 20th century, the guy who basically defined American modernist style in the 50s and 60s. His platform benches were iconic pieces, the kind of furniture that serious collectors would fight over at auctions. But here's where it got really interesting. These weren't just any Nelson platform benches. According to Richard, these appear to be from a 1958 production run that most experts believed had been completely lost. The story, as Richard explained it, was that Nelson's company had produced a limited series of these benches using a specific wood finish and hardware combination that was only manufactured for about 6 months. The entire production run had supposedly been shipped to a high-end furniture distributor on the West Coast, but the distributor went out of business before the pieces could be sold. Nobody knew what had happened to the inventory. Some people thought it had been sold off cheaply to discount stores. Others believed it had been destroyed rather than sold below cost. But here I was, with what looked like original, unassembled examples from that legendary lost shipment. Richard was trying to stay professional, but I could see he was barely containing his excitement. He kept picking up pieces and examining them under his magnifying glass, muttering things about grain patterns and hardware specifications that I didn't fully understand. This was like an art historian discovering a lost painting in someone's garage sale. The potential value, according to Richard, was staggering. Individual Nelson platform benches, in good condition, regularly sold for $20,000 to $30,000 at major auction houses. But these weren't just in good condition. They were pristine, unassembled originals that had never been used. Collector pieces that belonged to museums or the homes of serious design enthusiasts with serious money. Richard estimated that each complete bench set could be worth anywhere from $40,000 to $60,000, depending on the specific configuration and enthusiasm of potential buyers. And from what he could see in the components I brought, I probably had enough pieces to assemble at least 3 or 4 complete benches. Maybe more if the other crates contained additional hardware and components. We were potentially talking about $250,000 worth of furniture that had been sitting in Dad's basement, forgotten and ignored for more than 60 years. Furniture that Mike had essentially given away because he thought it was worthless storage clutter. Richard wanted to see everything immediately. He was practically vibrating with excitement at this point, talking about authentication processes and documentation requirements, about contacting auction houses and private collectors who would be interested in acquiring pieces from the lost Nelson series. This was the kind of discovery that could make careers in the furniture world. But first, he needed to examine all the components to verify authenticity and assess condition. He wanted to document everything with professional photography, research the provenance, and create a complete catalog of what I'd found. If these pieces were authentic, and he was increasingly convinced they were, then proper documentation would be crucial for maximizing their value at auction. We arranged for me to bring everything to his workshop the following week. Richard would provide secure storage and handle all the authentication work in exchange for a percentage of the eventual sale proceeds. It was a generous offer, considering that I'd basically walked off the street with what most people would consider a crazy story about finding treasure in their dead father's basement. The drive back to my trailer felt completely surreal. 6 hours earlier, I'd been a broke, unemployed guy facing the possibility of homelessness. Now I was potentially sitting on enough money to completely change my life. It was like winning the lottery, except instead of numbers matching on a ticket, it was with grain patterns matching in antique furniture catalogs. I kept expecting to wake up from this dream, or for Richard to call and tell me he'd made a mistake, that the pieces were actually worthless reproductions. But when I got home and looked at those wooden crates with fresh eyes, I could see what Richard had seen. The quality was unmistakable. This wasn't junk furniture that someone had stored and forgotten. This was serious craftsmanship, the kind of work that was built to last for generations. The irony wasn't lost on me. Mike had taken everything he thought was valuable from Dad's business, leaving me with what he considered worthless basement clutter. But in his arrogance and ignorance, he'd given away the most valuable thing in the entire shop. Sometimes the real treasure is hidden in the places nobody thinks to look. That evening, I called my cousin in Phoenix to tell him I wouldn't be needing that construction job after all. I couldn't explain the whole story yet. It was too crazy, too unbelievable. But I told him things were looking up. For the first time in months, that wasn't just wishful thinking. Little did I know that my newfound fortune was about to create problems I never could have anticipated. When family money gets involved, even brothers who haven't spoken in months suddenly become very interested in having conversations. And Mike was about to discover that sometimes the things you throw away turn out to be exactly what you needed to keep. News travels fast in small towns, especially when it involves money. I'd been careful not to say too much about my discovery, but Richard had to contact insurance companies and auction houses to properly document the Nelson pieces. Professional authentication requires a paper trail, and paper trails leave traces that people notice. Within 2 weeks of my workshop visit, word had somehow gotten back to Mike. I'm still not sure exactly how. Maybe through one of the antique dealers Richard contacted. Maybe through someone at the insurance company who knew about Dad's business. All I know is that I came home from a grocery run to find Mike's truck parked outside my trailer. Engine still running like he was planning a quick conversation. He was leaning against my front steps with his arms crossed, wearing that expression he used to get as a kid when he thought I'd taken something that belonged to him. The same look he'd had when Mom gave me the bigger piece of birthday cake, or when Dad praised my woodworking skills in front of relatives. Mike always had trouble sharing attention, even as adults. The conversation started civil enough. Mike said he'd heard I was having some valuable furniture appraised, and he was curious about where I'd found such expensive pieces. His tone was casual, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Mike had always been good at hiding his emotions, but 15 years of being brothers teaches you to read the signs. I explained about the crates from Dad's basement, about discovering they contained unassembled George Nelson benches that were apparently worth serious money. Mike listened without interrupting, but his expression got darker with every detail. By the time I finished explaining about the authentication process and potential auction values, he looked like he wanted to punch something. That's when the accusations started. According to Mike, those crates had never been in Dad's basement storage area. He'd gone through every inch of the building after taking over the business, cataloging inventory and organizing the workspace. He would have noticed wooden crates containing valuable furniture components. The only explanation in his mind was that I'd stolen them before leaving the shop. The logic, from Mike's perspective, made perfect sense. I'd worked in the business for years, had access to all the storage areas, knew which items were valuable and which weren't. Maybe I discovered the Nelson pieces months or years earlier and hidden them away, planning to claim them as my own after Dad passed away. Maybe the whole story about basement storage was just a cover for what amounted to theft of business inventory. Mike's accusation hit me like a physical blow, not just because he was calling me a thief, but because it revealed how little he really knew about me. After growing up together, after working side by side in Dad's shop, he genuinely believed I was capable of stealing from our own family business. The brother who used to defend me from bullies in elementary school now saw me as someone who'd robbed from our father's memory. I tried explaining that he'd personally given me permission to take those crates, that he'd watched me load them into my truck, that he'd dismissed them as worthless junk not worth keeping. But Mike's memory of that day was apparently different from mine. According to him, he'd never seen any wooden crates, and he certainly hadn't given me permission to remove valuable inventory from premises. The conversation escalated quickly from there. Mike started talking about filing police reports for theft, about contacting lawyers to recover stolen business property, about making sure I face consequences for betraying the family trust. His voice got louder and more aggressive, drawing attention from neighbors who probably had nothing better to do than eavesdrop on trailer park drama. I kept my cool as long as I could, trying to reason with him, try to remind him of Dad's actual wishes about splitting the business. But Mike wasn't interested in reasonable conversation anymore. He convinced himself that I was a thief who'd been planning this theft for years, waiting for the right opportunity to steal valuable inventory and claim it as my own discovery. Finally, I'd heard enough. I told Mike he was welcome to call the police if he wanted to file a theft report. I told him he could contact lawyers and insurance companies and anyone else who might listen to his conspiracy theories. But I also told him that I had evidence he probably hadn't considered, and that making false accusations could backfire in ways he might not expect. The evidence I was referring to was actually pretty simple, though I hadn't realized its importance until Mike started making accusations. Remember how I mentioned taking pictures while loading those crates into my truck? Well, it turns out I'd actually recorded video that day without really thinking about it. Just habit, really. I'd been documenting Dad's shop for personal memories, trying to capture details before everything changed. That video showed Mike clearly telling me to take whatever I wanted from the basement storage area. You could hear his exact words. Take that junk if it means something to you. Clear out so I don't have to deal with it later. The timestamp proved it was recorded on my last day at the shop, and Mike's face was clearly visible as he dismissed the crates as worthless storage clutter. Mike's expression changed completely when I mentioned the video evidence. The aggressive confidence disappeared, replaced by the kind of panic you see in people who realize they've made a serious miscalculation. He'd been so focused on the potential value of the Nelson pieces that he'd forgotten about his own role in giving them away. But Mike wasn't ready to give up entirely. He pivoted to a new strategy: claiming that even if he'd given me permission to take the crates, that permission was based on incomplete information. If he'd known they contained valuable furniture components, he never would have let me remove them from the business premises. The whole transaction was invalid because I withheld crucial information about their true worth. This argument was even weaker than his theft accusation, and we both knew it. You can't retroactively cancel a transaction because you later discovered you made a bad deal. If that were legally possible, every garage sale and flea market in America would be shut down by people demanding to reverse purchases that turned out to be more valuable than expected. I pointed out that neither of us had known what was in those crates when Mike gave them to me. I discovered their value through my own research and effort, working with experts who could identify and authenticate the pieces. Mike's regret about letting them go didn't change the legal reality of the situation, especially with video evidence documenting his consent to the transfer. Mike spent another 20 minutes trying different approaches, claiming the video was edited, arguing that business partnerships created different legal obligations, suggesting that Dad's unwritten intentions should override documented transactions. None of it made much legal sense, but I could see he was desperately trying to find some angle that would let him claim ownership of the Nelson pieces. Finally, I suggested he might want to consult with an actual lawyer before making any more accusations or threats. Professional legal advice would probably be more reliable than whatever half-remembered business law he thought he understood. And any lawyer worth their fees would want to see all the evidence before advising him on the strength of his potential claims. Mike left that afternoon without resolving anything, but I could tell his confidence was shaken. The video evidence had undermined his theft narrative, and his other arguments were clearly desperate attempts to find some legal loophole that would let him reclaim property he'd voluntarily given away. Over the next few days, I didn't hear anything from Mike directly, but I started getting calls from people who'd apparently been contacted by him. Other antique dealers in town, former customers of Dad's business, even some of our relatives. Mike was apparently conducting his own investigation, trying to build a case that the Nelson pieces rightfully belonged to the business rather than to me personally. Most people were polite, but clearly uncomfortable being dragged into family drama. A few mentioned that Mike seemed really stressed about something, more agitated than they'd ever seen him. Running a business alone was apparently harder than he'd expected, especially without Dad's expertise to guide major decisions or my craftsmanship skills to handle the technical restoration work. I started to wonder if Mike's desperate attempts to claim the Nelson pieces were about more than just their monetary value. Maybe the business wasn't doing as well as he'd expected. Maybe taking on all that responsibility without help was proving more challenging than his pride had let him admit. Maybe he needed that $250,000 windfall for reasons he wasn't willing to discuss. Richard called during this period to update me on the authentication process. Everything was proceeding smoothly. The Nelson pieces were definitely authentic. The documentation was solid, and several major collectors had already expressed serious interest. We were looking at auction dates in about 6 weeks, with pre-sale estimates that kept climbing as word spread to the high-end furniture collecting community. I mentioned Mike's accusations and threats, just to make sure Richard was aware of potential complications. Richard wasn't particularly worried. He'd dealt with family disputes over valuable discoveries before, and the video evidence seemed to clearly establish my legal ownership. But he suggested documenting everything carefully, just in case Mike decided to pursue legal action that could delay the auction process. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Mike had pushed me out of the business because he thought I didn't contribute enough value, that my skills weren't essential to the operation's success. Now he was desperately trying to claim ownership of valuable property that he'd literally given away because he couldn't recognize its worth. Sometimes karma works in mysterious ways. Little did I know that Mike's financial situation was even worse than I'd suspected, and that his attempt to claim the Nelson pieces were actually part of a much larger crisis that was about to come to light. When people get desperate enough, they'll try almost anything to save themselves, even if it means destroying relationships that used to matter to them. The real test of our family bonds was still to come, and it would reveal just how far Mike was willing to go to salvage his pride and his business. Sometimes the people you think you know best turn out to be capable of surprises that change everything you thought you understood about them. 8 months passed in silence. The Nelson furniture auction exceeded all expectations, for a complete bench that sold for just over $300,000. After Richard's commission and all expenses, I cleared about $240,000. Not bad for basement junk that nobody wanted. I bought a decent house in the good part of town and put the rest in savings. For the first time in my adult life, I had financial security and could make decisions based on what I wanted rather than what I could afford. Meanwhile, word around town was that Mike's business was struggling. Customers complained about longer completion times, lower quality work, and higher prices. Without my restoration expertise, Mike had to outsource technical work, cutting into profit margins. Without Dad's connections, he couldn't maintain the personal relationships that had kept the business profitable for years. Several long-time customers took their work elsewhere. Mrs. Henderson, whose dining set I'd been working on when Dad died, hired a restoration shop in the next town over because Mike couldn't provide the level of quality she expected. Then one morning in March, Mike showed up at my front door. Not the aggressive Mike from our trailer park confrontation, but a broken version I barely recognized. He looked like he'd aged 5 years and 8 months. Thinner, grayer, with deep fatigue from months of stress. We sat on my front porch drinking coffee, while Mike struggled to find words. When he finally started talking, the story was worse than I'd expected. The business wasn't just struggling, it was failing catastrophically. Mike had taken out loans using the shop as collateral, hoping to expand without Dad's guidance or my assistance. Instead, he'd overextended just as revenue began to decline. Between equipment loans, inventory financing, and credit lines, Mike owed nearly $200,000. Monthly payments consumed most of the business income, and he was 3 months behind on everything. The bank had scheduled a foreclosure hearing for the following month. Mike's voice trembled as he explained how he'd tried everything, cutting expenses, raising prices, working longer hours. Nothing worked because the fundamental problem wasn't financial management. It was that he'd never learned the skills that actually made the business valuable. The request, when it finally came, was both predictable and heartbreaking. Mike needed money to save the business. Specifically, he needed about $200,000 to pay off the loans. He knew I had money from a Nelson furniture sale. He was asking me to essentially buy back into a business he'd stolen from me 8 months earlier. When he finished his pitch, we sat in silence for several minutes. Mike kept glancing at me hopefully, probably trying to read my expression for signs of sympathy or willingness to help. "I didn't come here with anger," he said quietly. "Just help me. I have debts. If I can't find $200,000, they'll shut everything down." I looked at him. No pity, no hatred, just understanding. "You said this wasn't my business. And you were right. This isn't my business anymore." Mike tried arguing that we were family, that Dad would want us to work together, that saving the business was more important than our personal conflicts. But his arguments fell flat, because we both knew he'd had the same opportunities to consider family loyalty when he was forging documents and throwing me out. I wasn't cruel about it. I didn't lecture him or gloat over his failures. I simply explained that he'd made his choice about how to handle Dad's legacy, and now he'd have to live with the consequences. Mike left that morning without saying goodbye. A month later, the foreclosure went through as scheduled, and Dad's shop was put up for auction to pay off Mike's debts. I came to that auction and bought the business. The irony wasn't lost on me. Now I own the same shop I'd been thrown out of 8 months earlier. I didn't change the sign, left everything as it was, but transformed the shop into a high-end showroom. Only the highest quality work, specializing in authentic antique restoration and mid-century modern pieces. I kept Dad's tools and techniques alive, but now it was a space that honored quality over quantity. In the front window, I displayed one of the Nelson benches I'd kept for myself. The one piece I didn't sell at auction, and under the nameplate, I added a line. "Value isn't always what glitters. It's what's made with love." Dad would have appreciated the irony. Mike got everything he thought was valuable and lost it all. I got what he considered worthless junk and built a new life from it.